Hello, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on strategies for creating cultures of innovation in engineering teams. This is a Lead Dev webinar created in partnership with PepsiCo. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the Lead Dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Building Software channel. So let's get started with some introductions. I'm Kevin Goldsmith. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Anaconda. And today I'm going to be joined by Amy Yu, Vice President of Product Strategy and Data Science at Viacom, where she leads the design and development of visualization tools that enable data-driven decisions across all of Viacom's portfolio brands. We have Jessica Rutter. Jessica is a software engineer at GitHub and on the GitHub education team, where she builds tools to empower the next generation of software developers. And we have David Antaramian. David is a software engineering manager at PepsiCo e-commerce in New York City, where he helps build their sales and search marketing automation platform. David has helped grow the e-commerce, digital technology, and experience team from 2 software engineers to over 60 engineers, designers, and product managers in just under 2 years. So welcome panelists, and welcome to everyone that's watching. We're going to start out with a question just to help frame the discussion, and I'll go through each of the panelists and just ask for your answer. So the question is, what does innovation mean for your team? What does it look like in your team or group or industry, whatever? I'm going to start with Amy. What's your take on what innovation means for your team?
Thanks, Kevin. So, my team is kind of an interesting team in that we kind of are a hybrid of product and development, and we sit within research instead of technology. And, we're part of a global media business, right? And so when we think about innovation, there's kind of, various scales of innovation that are happening in the industry. You think there's a ton of change and there's a ton of innovation happening both at the content and at the distribution level in terms of how our audiences are engaging with our content and what types of content we're producing and what form that content takes, and how we're choosing to invest in the next generation of content. And so, at the scale of the company, right, we have to think about, how do we invest in data and technology to drive innovation in the space that we're competing in, which is content and entertainment experiences. And so that's kind of where my team comes in, is that we kind of sit at that intersection of technology and data. And what that means on a day-to-day and on, and in terms of the roadmap level for my team is that, we really try to bake in, room for experimentation and prototyping, and room to think about the new types of data sets that we need to be working with to help the company as a whole evolve and to drive the strategy that we as a company take in terms of thinking about our next generation of content and experiences for our fans, whether it's live experiences, whether it's things like taking tent poles like the VMAs to a digital experience in our current state of affairs with COVID and with the global pandemic, whether it's thinking about how do we drive growth in our new owned and operated platforms and newer platforms that we're going to be launching, such as Paramount Plus, and also in thinking about how, where our audiences will be next in terms of where are the next generation types of experiences, whether it's VR, AR, and those sorts of platforms. And so for my team, what that means is, making sure that we are innovating in the space of both data as well as technology in terms of evolving and thinking about how do we stay creative in these spaces so that we can enable our business to drive innovation in the forward content that we're creating.
Great. David, what about at PepsiCo?
Yeah, and I'll talk specifically about PepsiCo e-commerce since that's really my sphere. with this, and innovation changes from company to company, and it's really that I think is the most interesting point. PepsiCo, with how mature it is as a company, it's very interesting coming in as an engineer and understanding innovation here means something that at another company is actually not innovative at all. And I usually give the idea of when we do email notifications. That's actually transformative to our business function right now. Something that a lot of engineers might consider, bread and butter. It's like, oh yeah, I can do, an email notification in an hour. But for us, it's just amazing how much transformation in terms of the business value we get by immediately notifying someone of a critical business operation or event. They can action on that. It's something that they might, in normal circumstances, might not know for 4 weeks, and yet we're getting it to them as it happens. That's innovation, that's transformation. And a lot of what we measure this by in terms of innovation is optimizing time to value. It's how much value can we as an engineering team deliver in a set amount of time. And basically when we make a choice of we can do X or we can do Y, it's what delivers more value in that time frame.
I like that framing of optimizing time to value. I think that's an interesting kind of way of looking at it. Jessica, how about your team? What does innovation look like in your team at GitHub?
Yeah, so I sit in the education team, and ed tech is very interesting in that a lot of ed tech is about disruption. People are like, let's get rid of colleges, let's get rid of teachers, let's have students on computers. And what we're seeing right now in the pandemic is like, while there may be places for that, it's not necessarily the future everyone wants. And what I've really liked about working in education at GitHub is that so many of the people come from an education background. They're former teachers. They're people that have a lot of respect for like both educators themselves, like what skills they have, as well as the science and all the thought. Like there are literally centuries of studies behind how educators work. And a lot of tech companies come in and they're like, no, 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 whatever, we're going to get rid of all of that. And then they fail and they fail and they fail. And at GitHub, for us, innovation is very much working with those teachers to help them scale their classrooms, give themselves more time to teach, more creative ways to teach, like empowering them to do the kinds of things they want to, but don't have like the tools or time to do. And so for us, it's a lot less of the get the smartest people in Silicon Valley in a room and give the teachers what we think they want. It's about partnering with educators and some of the smartest people in Silicon Valley, and some people like myself, and coming up with ways that we can empower them. But the other thing that's very interesting is we always have this sense of we can't just move fast and break things because there are teachers teaching classes, there are students doing homework right now. So our innovation has to be thoughtful, goes on like a semester cadence of like, if we're going to try something new, it needs to be out before teachers are already doing their lesson plans. And as we increase into a global scope with the teachers and classrooms that we're serving, we've increasingly had to think about more like, how do educators outside of the United States work, outside of a Western context work? What do they need for their classrooms? And so it's kind of being innovative, but partnering in what people actually want, as opposed to what we think will totally disrupt their environments.
I really like that point you made, Jessica. I started in computer graphics, and everything was being discovered, and it was all new, and we were doing all this great innovation, and it turns out that we were just rediscovering things that the signal processing people had done literally 50 years before. Just nobody had actually bothered to read the literature. I think we in tech absolutely sometimes mistake our own innovation for just actually lack of knowledge and lack of actually understanding the domains that we're trying to innovate in. So I think that's a really important point when we talk about building a strategy, a culture of innovation, but then also kind of understanding the domain in which we're trying to innovate. And that's an important part of building that culture. That's a very excellent point. Let's move on to another question. So what are the cultural elements when we talk about like actually creating a culture of innovation within your teams, what are the cultural elements that that you try and create in your teams to support that innovative culture? Let's start, this time we'll start with David.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is coaching team members to understand the business as a whole. It's understanding the business domain. That really gives them the initiative to come up with the best solutions they can. So we start with the problem statement. We don't start with the solution. And then we work towards how can we solve this together? My team specifically exists in a very great space actually, where we interact directly with the business team members. So now that we're in a fully remote situation, it's a little bit different. But when we were in an office situation, our business users were in the same room as us. Like when something went wrong, it wasn't like, hey, send an email. It was literally they were shouting across the room, hey, David, why is this not working? And I'm going over to them, right, and working with them immediately. And that's a great situation. And a lot of the people on my team now are familiar with how to do search marketing, how kind of our product sales process works. And so they're able to come up with these great ideas about, hey, what if instead of this idea that the users think they need, right, actually delivering what they need in a much better way and delivering a lot more value to the business overall. And to that end, we let our team members take responsibility for the work, and that lets them feel ownership over it. And then they can start delivering in an iterative manner, getting feedback. And these are things that are simple, and these are things that I think the software industry has known for years, but it's things that we keep having to come back to and rediscover almost and reapply. So, it sounds simple. It doesn't end up being as simple as we want it to all the time, though.
I like that you put it in terms of value, and that you also put it in terms of collaboration in a cross-functional way and working with the business. I think that's a really good point. Amy, let's talk about for you, what are the cultural elements you try and instill in your team to create that culture of innovation?
Sure. So I think that there's kind of three big elements that we try to really, bake into our team culture that kind of help to facilitate, innovation in terms of ideas and in terms of strategy, which is one, cultivating a culture of learning where, where folks are empowered to, try new things and develop new skills while they're working on tactical projects or while they're working on, specific directed priorities from the business. I think, carving out opportunities for people to be able to learn in the context of what they're doing is important. What we try to do is, for example, I try to make sure that people across the team get exposure to new projects or projects that they get a chance to work with other folks across the team where they might not be the expert at that project, but it gives them an opportunity to kind of grow and be uncomfortable, but also, expand their own skill set and their own knowledge base. And then on the other side of it, what we do is we, have times for lunch and learns and things where folks get a chance to teach others, right? Because actually the best way to learn something yourself is to teach other people about it. Because then you get questions and you actually, get the opportunity to kind of deep dive into an area that you're interested in getting to know more about. The second piece is kind of hard to define, but it's around increasing serendipity on the team. I think that is actually a really important piece in terms of enabling innovation. And serendipity can take a lot of different forms, right? So one, I think, to David's point, definitely being close to the business and hearing both the needs and the questions and the problems that they're trying to solve, that is a great way of giving your team exposure in terms of thinking about new ideas and new ways of addressing those problems. Serendipity can also mean, in your hiring practices, hiring people with non-traditional backgrounds. I have a really great lead developer on my team who, she came from an art background actually. And it's really interesting to see the ways in which she thinks about and solves problems, and also giving her exposure to things like DevOps and new parts of the infrastructure that she's been interested in learning, and seeing the way that she approaches those problems has been, really interesting in terms of helping other folks across the team actually learn as well. And then the third piece is kind of tying those two together, is really creating a culture around experimentation. And that could mean both in terms of experimentation in terms of the types of projects that your team takes on, but also, carving out space for people on the team to be able to define their own projects. So, I took a page from Google's book, and we actually have 20% projects on my team as well. But, on my team, since we're, pretty small and resource constrained, sometimes what we want to do is make sure that instead of blue sky projects, right, what we do is we, allow people on the team to kind of think about what are projects that are not in our direct priorities roadmap right now, but something that could benefit the team in the medium to long term, something that we're not addressing right now. And I try to give my team space to carve out a 20% project where they take either one day a week or they take a couple hours a day to kind of be able to context switch and think about another problem that might not be in our critical path right now. And, I found that actually those projects have evolved into bigger initiatives for the team and things that have really created impact and created value for both our team and for the business. So kind of, those are kind of the three areas that we really try to emphasize to, enable innovation on our team.
I mean, I absolutely, your 3 points around that I think are perfect, right? I think the serendipity that comes through diversity, building diverse teams, and folks with different backgrounds that bring different perspectives, absolutely critical. Creating a culture of learning, truly great. Building experimentation time, and having it be okay to fail in your experiments, and that being part of a culture of learning. I think that's a really good kind of characterization and good steps to take for any team. That's great. Jessica, how about within your team? And speaking of learning, creating a culture of learning.
Yeah. So I think for me, especially as an individual contributor, like the number one thing that helps me to be willing to like experiment and try to be innovative is like a deep assurance, like a true belief that if I fail, I'm not going to be penalized. Long before I worked in engineering, I worked in, it was a boutique search engine marketing company. The majority of people there were engineers. I was an account manager. And I made a simple mistake, but it cost $30,000. There was an account we were moving from the client's account into our own account. And we were going to let them run simultaneously for a week. And then I was supposed to shut one off and only run in our account. And I forgot to shut theirs off. So I overspent by double what the client wanted to spend that week. And so I knew my job was done. Like that was over half my salary at the time. And I was like, I just hope like I'll figure out a way to pay them back and everything. And the CTO co-founder was like, hey, like I've made mistakes that have cost us way more than that. It's not a big deal. We should have had a process in place. And he was just very understanding and not this sort of like, oh, you stupid child, whatever, we'll clean up after you, but like truly understanding about like, hey, we need a process so that this doesn't happen in the future. And he also said, I bet no one on this team is going to be more careful moving forward than you are, which was very true. And so later when that CTO came to me and said, hey, would you like to learn how to write your own SQL queries so that you can get data that the engineers don't have in prepared reports for you? I was like, oh, I don't have to worry that if I'm bad at this, it's going to look poorly. Like, I truly believe that he was okay with me failing. And when he said, do you want to learn how to parse the XML feeds to find breakages because the engineers don't have time for that? And like, it seems like it's something you're interested in. I trusted that like, if I were bad at it, I would have time to learn. And so my path to becoming an engineer was directly through that CTO, like very much being okay with failure and giving me ways to like grow through it and being able to trust that like I could continue being bad at something until I got better at it. And it was something I sort of intuitively understood. And then a few years ago, I didn't do research. I started reading research about failure for a talk I was doing. And it turns out like that's actually something that they've studied. There was this one study, and I think it was Johnson, but I'm not positive. But she looked at hospitals, and her hypothesis was that hospitals that have fewer errors were going to have better patient outcomes. And what they found was that hospitals that had more errors had better patient outcomes. And it was because at those hospitals, people felt safe to like report the errors and then figure out what went wrong and how to make it better. And so those failures and learning from those failures made people safer. It makes like your team work better. And so, yeah, it's the same, I think, on pretty much any team, but certainly engineering teams, is if people, there's that old quote, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. And it's not that IBM was bad, it was just safe. But, there were other things that you might have tried, but no one was going to if their job was on the line. And so, yeah, like just knowing that I can fail if I experiment, and that will also be like rewarded and celebrated just as much as like heroic efforts working through the weekend to like get something up, that helps, I think, a team be very innovative.
I love that story. That's a really inspiring story. I think all of us would want to be more like your CTO from your company. Not only was, you know, made you comfortable when you made a mistake, but then also kind of use that to help mentor you and grow your career. That's yeah. I think for all the leads and sort of aspiring leads and that are watching, I mean, we should all try and be more like that. That's a great story. And yeah, the criticality of failure in innovation is true. Like if you haven't failed, you're not really trying, right? You can't do something hard that hasn't been done before. You can't do it perfect the first time. It's going to take a few hundred different tries. That's great. One of the things, having been in these kind of panels before and given talks at LeadDev, one of the things you often get questions on is, well, that's great. It's great that, PepsiCo is creating these great culture and Viacom and GitHub, but at my company, I'd like to create a safe to fail culture, or in my team, or I want to do some of these things you're talking about, but it's a little bit harder because of the culture of my larger organization or my culture of my company. So I'm curious, what obstacle, so it sounds like, oh, it's really easy and we can just do these great things, but in reality, maybe not even your current company, but prior company, what's been an obstacle that's made it difficult that you've had to overcome in order to try and do some of the things that you're doing in your teams? I'm going to pick on, nobody volunteered to answer this one, surprisingly. So I'm going to start, I'll start with you, Jessica, this time, just because you're coming from a different, more of an IC type of perspective.
Yeah, I mean, this is incredibly difficult, I think, especially the lower you are on the totem pole, the more at risk your job is in an organization. And so one thing in an organization, if they don't celebrate failures, if they're not like, well, let's be innovative, it's tougher to be like, well, I'm going to go out there and be innovative and it'll just work out for me. So one thing that I do is if I'm at an organization, and I've certainly worked in those that aren't innovative and don't celebrate failures, is I make sure I understand like sort of what the rules are at the company, what the ground rules are, because then I know what risks I'm taking and I can take the risks that I'm comfortable with. And I also know what risks anyone else on my team would be taking, because I do not want anyone to be in a situation where they risk their livelihood, their health insurance, their ability to pay their rent and put food on their table, just because that innovation actually ultimately would have helped a company that would punish them if they fail. And so like, once I know that groundwork, then within my own team, I can help people to feel comfortable. So even if it's like, okay, look, we're not going to talk about these failures outside, because then the head of engineering is going to be like, why do people on your team mess up so much? But inside we can talk about them and we can celebrate them and externally we'll just celebrate the wins. But I think it is very important wherever you are in the organization to know like what risk you're exposing people to, so that you can protect them from that. So yeah, that's the main thing I'd say. So like if you're a manager and you know like, hey, I am expected to lay people off if they fail, like make sure your teammates know that, so that like your direct reports aren't like, oh, I tried something, it failed, but I learned a lot. And then what the people above them are hearing is like, oh, you need to go.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. So David or Amy, either of you have wanted to chime in on this?
Sure. Go for it, David. Do you want to
Okay,
go
all
first?
right. I'll go for it first.
Sure.
So I was just going to kind of follow up from more of a management perspective. And as you kind of noted, Kevin, at least my group is in a space where we're innovative already. Talking about obstacles specifically that we've faced, it's actually been about helping people who are not coming from innovative companies to speak up and be innovative because they feel that they're going to be penalized for it. And they just, it's a fear really. And it's one that as a manager and working with other managers in the group, I have to, be like, no, this is totally fine to come forward and say what you think. And that's honestly, I do a lot of that during stand-ups, during retrospectives, during postmortems, especially, to be like, hey, no, it is totally fine. And I think going back to what Jessica was, the story Jessica told, which I think is just amazing. Like that story was wonderful and so illustrative. We really, as kind of engineering leadership, have to take a blameless track where it's like, no, there are systems that need to be in place that, protect against, that are fail safes essentially, so that our engineers feel free to experiment, so that they feel free to go and actually do and try things, and that we can be assured that, the processes are going to catch them, and that we know how to then, when the processes fail, to correct those processes, not feel that the humans need to be corrected, because humans fail. It's part of who we are. It's also part of what makes us great and what helps us grow. So, that's kind of my feeling on this here.
Yeah, I mean, systems plus 100, right? Systems, creating systems to make failure safe, that generate processes that work. And I also very much like your point around people learn, we can create cultures of innovation that teach people to be innovative, but people joining our team may be coming from the polar opposite, where they've been taught not to speak up, not to try things. And you're right, it's somebody new joining your team, you may have to kind of overcome their past and try and make sure that they understand that they have that within your team. Amy, anything on this?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say in terms of kind of obstacles or challenges to innovation, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is kind of fighting the status quo of what everybody is used to doing. I think that's just across the board, at least, in terms of, how do you fight against processes that may already be in place that kind of work, but are not going to get you to that next step of where you need to go as a team or as a business. I think actually, Jessica, to your point around, risk and kind of how you assess risk at various levels on your team, it's actually interesting that you say that kind of it feels like the risk is the highest when you're lowest on the totem pole, because I actually feel like when you talk to executives, when you talk to people who are higher than you, and when you talk to, all the way up to kind of, the highest levels in at the C-level, your concerns in terms of managing expectations kind of change, right? And there's kind of different levels of concerns and expectations that you're trying to manage around. And sometimes I feel like executives are, at my level or even higher, right? Like sometimes we are the ones that need to check ourselves in terms of how much we adhere to the status quo of what we're used to, right? And for me, actually, I came from starting as an IC on my team, and I would say I probably had kind of a high risk kind of role where I was hired on as kind of the first dev hire in the team to try and think about how do we scale up what the data science team was doing in terms of helping solve problems across the business and help bringing analytics to business decisions, right? And what I learned from that experience actually was that, in order to create space for innovation, sometimes you have to strategize in terms of what are short-term wins that you can get to convince people to give you more room for failure and give you more room to experiment, right? And I think, if you're in a company or in a team where, people are kind of, either afraid of failure or kind of have kind of this culture where, you're expected to kind of, work on the next ticket or solve the problem at hand. What I try to do is think about what are kind of impactful short-term wins that you can prove yourself with, and then that way you get the opportunity to propose that next idea and use that opportunity, right, to kind of carve that space out. And that's kind of how how my team evolved. That's kind of how I went from being an IC to being someone who is growing a team to being, the lead of a team that's growing and scaling a platform, right? Is that we continuously carved out more space to experiment. And actually by taking that risk, right, you end up reaping the reward on the other side.
Yeah, that's really great, Amy. I totally agree. Like building a series of wins that progressively larger lets you carve out that space. That's a really good point. For the folks that are watching, I want to just remind you, we do have a Q&A. You can launch a Q&A window and add your questions there. I will be watching those. We've got about 15 minutes left in the sort of video portion. We will be answering questions in Slack afterwards as well. So Jessica, I want to ask you this question. If I'm a lead developer, if I'm watching this talk and I'm a lead developer and I'm trying to encourage more innovation in my team, where should I start? We just had Amy talking about kind of small wins. That's absolutely a great way to do it. What are other ways we can do it?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the stuff that's already been covered is fantastic places to start. I love some of the lead developers that I've worked with that I've just really grown a lot under. They've sort of taken the approach of like giving me tasks that I didn't feel I was ready for, that they knew would be a stretch for me, and then being a resource for that. So, left to my own devices, I'd slowly be growing, like I'd get there, but I wouldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, let me handle the entire database transition from Postgres to MySQL. I'm like, no, that's something that like a senior person should handle, a live database transition. And they're like, no, we'll be your resources. And so showing people that you're confident in them, but then also making sure that like you're there to help them and that that you actually do help. So one of the worst things I think as a lead is being like, yeah, if you get stuck, let me know. And the person gets stuck and then you're like, oh, I'm busy on my own stuff. Maybe some other time. And you're like, okay, well then my work is just completely blocked until this other person gets me unstuck. So yeah, like trusting the person, pushing them just slightly beyond their comfort zone, truly being available as a resource for them. And then I think also modeling the kind of behavior you want them to have. So if as a tech lead, you're only taking on things that are sure wins that you know are going to be celebrated and like definitely work, then it's hard to then point to your team and say like, okay, but I want you folks to take risks and be innovative, because people have eyes and people see what you're doing. So continuing at the level that you're at to also take risks and be innovative and model that behavior. I think all of those are very important.
I'm muted. Or was I not? All right, I was. Okay, I have a secret mute button you can't see. David, I'm going to pose this question to you. If the organization I'm in makes it challenging to support a more innovative culture, we've talked a little bit about that in kind of challenges to building a culture. But if the larger company, right, if you're just in a company that punishes failure, that doesn't reward experimentation, what can I do if I'm a leader, or let's talk lead dev, but even let's talk you're in a more senior role now. What can you do inside of a larger company?
Yeah, no, I love this question. I think, it does depend a little bit on position, but a lot more of it is about your skill set. It's interesting, I actually had this conversation with my own manager about 2 or 3 months ago when we were talking about our team members and skill sets. And he suddenly told me, he was like, well, I really want our team to start building their sales and marketing skill set. And he didn't mean in the terms of knowing how to like business and sell our product. He meant in terms of selling ideas to the rest of the company and being able to kind of market those ideas and be able to actually say, hey, this is something that we should do, and be convincing about it. I think it's something that people who come from a startup background have a little bit more familiarity with, because it's a necessity in that space. But when you come into a larger business where it's harder to do, you need to develop the skills to understand who has the agency to start changing this, who has the what are their kind of KPIs, what are they paying attention to, what do they value, and that is really what starts informing you about, okay, now I know how to start selling them and marketing them on how we can start changing the culture within our organization. It's not going to be immediate, but you start being able to kind of push at those buttons and know exactly how you start, kind of influencing people using those skills.
Cool. Cool. Great. Alrighty, we have a question from the audience. I'm going to see if there's one more question I'd like to take with the panel. And then if you're in the audience, you have questions, please answer or ask them. I will try, and I think we may have time to take at least one. Amy, this question is to you. So how do we build innovation into a non-innovative team? So people watching may say, that's great, but you're doing all this cool stuff at Viacom, but the team I'm on, like, we don't get to work on any really innovative stuff. Like, we're work on boring stuff, I guess you'd say. And I've had people say things like that to me. How do you find ways to innovate when the scope or the process you're in, the work is seemingly constrained?
So I think in that situation, you have to kind of think about how constraints can breed creativity, right? Because, on the other side of things, when you aren't operating without any constraints as well, that can also in and of itself be a challenge, right? And even on my team, we're certainly constrained by certain things, whether it's, how much resources we have in terms of the size of our team and what we can accomplish and what we aim to do, but also kind of, what exists in terms of current processes, right? And, to David's point around identifying the folks who have the agency to be able to make key decisions around projects and around priorities, that's kind of, one of the ways in which you can kind of work and evolve around your current given constraints, right? So whether it's talking to someone else on your team and coming up with an idea that you guys can both champion to your direct manager, whether it's looking for opportunities outside of your current team. So, for example, a lot of companies may have learning and development resources to tap into, whether it's being able to take a class or, something outside of your team where you get a chance to work on a project that then you bring into your team and say, hey, this is what I've been working on. This could be interesting applied in this way on this problem that we're trying to solve, and bringing new ideas and new tools to the discussion that way, right? And I think it's very much about thinking about ways in which you have the opportunity to evolve the conversations that you're having, both across your team, with your direct colleagues, with your direct manager, with your leadership, with other teams that you're working with, and kind of looking in the periphery for those opportunities to open that conversation and to open and think about new ideas in that way. When you don't have kind of the space already available to you, with the way that your team works already. I think that's how I would go about it. And it definitely takes a bit of creativity in thinking about where do you find those opportunities, right? But if you kind of look in the periphery, those opportunities definitely will exist no matter how small. And it's kind of just getting that door open. And once you kind of get that process going, right, following through on it, right? And again, getting that short-term win and building that momentum.
Great. I'd like to take, that's a great answer. I totally agree with that, Amy. I'd like to take we're going to take a question from the audience, from Vandela. She says, I love that you all are bring up starting from a problem instead of a solution. That's so crucial. How do you encourage ownership of that problem in the team, so that it's not just the product owner or product manager that's coming up with the problem? It's your problem. It's the team's problem. Who wants to jump in on this? Raise a hand.
I can go ahead. I love this question. And I'll, given our time frame, I'm just gonna first say, please go look up Empowered Product Teams by Marty Kagan, first and foremost. That is a huge thing. But no, the reason I say that is because our team works with our product owner and designer together in this iterative process where our designers coming in and kind of having these thoughts, and engineers are coming in kind of guiding on feasibility factors. And that is allowing us to iterate on this basis where the product owner is really presenting the problem, owning that from a problem statement view and saying, here are the things we need to solve this. Designers coming in from, here's how the user wants to flow in the product. And the engineers are coming in and being like, here's how we can make this feasible. Here are the things that won't work. Here are the things that would take too much time. And so it becomes a collective, a collective problem and a collective solution. And really, the product owner is helping navigate all of that for us, but also our engineering leads are also kind of pushing on engineers and being like, hey, you should participate in this. You should, participate a little bit more, trying to push people towards, here's how you can get a little more skill in this certain area because we know this is going to expand into there. I think that it really just flows into how a team can grow overall to really take on this type of ownership.
Great. Yeah, that's a great way to frame that answer. We're starting to get a lot more questions, which is great. Thank you all in the audience. I think I've been told we can go a little bit over, so we're going to maybe go a little bit over, but we can probably only do maybe one more question or maybe two. We'll see. I'm gonna, Jawad asks, how can you build on short-term wins towards your long-term goal that may have lost momentum, right? So this has been a weird year, no way around it. So you've had all these things that may impact the team's momentum. How do you build those short-term wins? Actually, because you talked about this, Amy, building on wins. Do you have what do you think about that?
Yeah, what I would say is, while you're working on a tactical problem or, a smaller scoped problem that, is going to have immediate impact, and you kind of have, a well-defined framing in terms of the problem that you're trying to tackle, right? In the context of doing that, what I would say is, do a bit of brainstorming as well, right? Like with the folks that you're working with on the project, with the product owner, with other devs, right? Think about what else you could be doing down the line to scale up, the effort that you're already putting in, right? Because there's always next steps. There's always future work that can be done to either improve, the solution that you're already building, to scale up on it in terms of, building it out for more users, for other use cases. And, I would say, when you are building and actually implementing the piece that you're going to deploy, bring those up in the discussions that you're having, like bring new ideas to the table and kind of seed those ideas so that you have kind of already started those conversations going forward in terms of next steps, right? Like put those ideas, in the brain of the product owner that you're working with, right? Because that way, that's something where it could potentially be incorporated in the future roadmap of what you're working on. But that's kind of how you scale up those conversations. I do agree though, right now, in terms of just the current work from home environment, things like that, it is incredibly difficult because that serendipity piece is hard to generate, right? Because instead of just having conversations while you're at the office, you have Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, and I would say in preparing for your stand-ups or preparing for your retros or things where you're already doing, bring up those new ideas in those discussions and then take the initiative to set up the next steps, right? And to keep those conversations going.
Awesome. We're going to take one final audience question, and then there's one that's on the deck that we won't get to. I'll paste that into the Slack channel, the building software channel in the lead dev Slack, and we'll answer it in there. But the last question, because this actually well aligns with what you talked about earlier, Jessica, this one's for you from John. How do you encourage your team members to explore other focus areas, look for approaches, solution templates that could be leveraged in the area that your team operates in? This could apply to specific engineering disciplines, signal processing to graphics, like I talked about, or even from non-engineering domains to engineering domains. So how do you encourage the rest of your team to kind of look outside to take advantage of that diversity that you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is important here is if you have hiring power, if you have the power to shape a team, one of the best things you can do is shape a diverse team, people from different backgrounds, cultures, disciplines. If everyone on your team is from MIT PhD programs, you probably have an amazing amount of technical knowledge on that team, but you're probably getting, assuming they're all from the same like comp sci PhD, you're probably getting a very narrow field point of view. So like build a team with diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences if you want people to be able to draw on that. Now, assuming you've already got a team in place and you don't want to like boot people off and say, sorry, I need different people than you, or you don't have hiring power, you've got the team you've got. I think it's, like encourage people's humanity. Like most people are naturally curious and they have interests in stuff outside of work. If the only thing you ever celebrate is someone getting off work and building a side project that's exactly like what they do at work, or someone getting off work and then doing more work, then that's what people are going to do. And that's what you're going to have to draw from in terms of experience. If you have teammates that like ask for 2 weeks off to go mountain biking in the wilderness and you give them a hard time on that, then, but if you like celebrate it, and now I know with D budgets, there are like IRS limitations, but if you allow that to be as like broadly interpreted as possible and like encourage people to go out and experience and draw on new things, you're going to have a team that can do that. And then I'd say the other piece is when someone says, okay, this is a bit of a wild thought, but what if we look at it this way? Instead of being annoyed and saying like, oh my gosh, we're on a tight deadline, why are you bringing this up? Saying like, oh, that's interesting, we have time to explore this. Those kinds of things are going to help a team be more able to draw on a deep pool of experience and knowledge and be more willing to.
Great, that's great. So we're kind of out of time for this part of the panel. I want to remind everyone that's watching that we will now, as a group, be heading over to that building software Slack channel in the lead dev Slack. So you can find instructions on how to join that if you haven't already on the lead dev website. So I wanted to get just parting thoughts from each of you just around this idea and things that you've learned today, or other things that you wish you talked about and didn't have a chance. We'll start with you, David.
Yeah, I mean, just from this discussion today, I think the key points to take away are, first and foremost, figure out what does innovation mean to you and to your company. And two, just bring people together, get people to raise their voice and say, here are things, here are ways we can solve things, and break down silos that you see. That to me, that's going to foster the innovation a lot of people need to see in their companies.
Amy?
I love Jessica's point around encouraging people's humanity and encouraging curiosity. I think that's a big piece of it. And then, I also wanted to just reiterate, increasing serendipity and thinking about how do you generate serendipity in your team, in your company. How do you create those spaces where, surprising and interesting and innovative things happen.
And Jessica?
Yeah, I think for me, what's important is for lead devs on up to be able to help reframe people's perceptions of like failures and frustrations as opportunities for learning. And like, especially right now during COVID-19, where so many people are working in situations that they're not used to working in, it can feel so frustrating. But what you really have here is this massive shared learning opportunity where we're seeing the edges and the cracks in everything we do in almost every industry. And both being human and experiencing that frustration, but saying like, okay, what can we learn? What are we going to improve from this? Like it's almost this amazing opportunity to say like, potentially revisit everything and make it better. And that's, yeah, so seeing those and helping your team see those opportunities is just so important.
Thanks to all of you. This was incredibly informative, a really interesting panel. I loved getting all your perspectives, and you all, I thought, brought a really cool kind of unique view into this discussion. So I want to thank all the panelists, amazing insights. So just final reminder, we're going to head over to the Lead Dev Slack now on the Building Software channel to continue the discussion. For everyone that joined and or is watching some point in the future, when watching the recording, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.